ladies and gentlemen. Anthony Bergen from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Thank you all very much for coming out tonight to hear the Commissioner. Apart from, of course, our guest speaker, could I also acknowledge here Secretary Pizzulo. I think Andrew Colvin, if he's not here, will be the Federal Police Commissioner will be here. Could I also acknowledge the new ambassador from the Philippines joining us here tonight, Minda Calayugan Cruz. Thank you very much, Minda, for coming along. I think we're all seeing the escalating volumes of people and goods moving across international borders. We're also seeing, of course, record numbers of sea and air travellers, as well as inspections by air and sea cargo. The Australian Border Force, of course, must tackle a range of transnational threats, issues relating to people smuggling, counter-terrorism, and, of course, the illicit trafficking of drugs and firearms. The ABF must ensure its investigation, compliance and detention functions all are operating at the very highest levels. Of course, sometimes we forget that the ABF devotes a lot of resources to its facilitation role at the border. It must collaborate with both regional and international partners, both at the policy and at the operational levels, to better manage the border. The ABF, of course, must work in tandem with the immigration side of the department. So in all, there are some major challenges here, and to talk us through them and to tell us where the ABF is heading, delighted to welcome Roman Quadrileg to address us. I think most of us now are, of course, aware that Roman took up the role of Commissioner when the ABF commenced its operations last year. Prior to that, he was the Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Customs and Border Protection Service. And, of course, many of us would know that he was also the Chief Police Officer for ACT Policing with the AFP, and before that he had a very long and distinguished career in the Queensland Police Force. So welcome, Roman. Roman will talk to us for about 20-25 minutes, and then I'll hand the interactive part of tonight's session over to Dr. John Coyne, who runs our border security program. Please, Roman, could you welcome the Commissioner?
Thanks, Anthony. I think you've actually covered my speech, so we might go straight to Q&A. Just a couple of acknowledgements. Can I acknowledge the Secretary of the Department of Immigration and Border Protection, good colleague, friend and partner in collaboration in the running of the DIBP enterprise and the ABF, which sits within it. We've been at this gig now for a couple of years, and we've achieved a lot, and I'm going to touch on some of that tonight, and we've still got a fair bit to go. So, Mike, welcome and thanks for your support. Your Excellency, Ambassador Cruz, thank you for your attendance, much appreciated. Thank you again for your support. Can I acknowledge the other guests in the audience? I had an opportunity to look at the guest list before I came in, and I recognised many names from the enforcement fraternity, many names from across the APS, and I thank you for your attendance also. Can I thank you, Peter Jennings and ASPI, for the partnership that we have. It's a border security partnership that we have. We invest, but we certainly believe that we get a dividend from that investment, and I thank particularly John Coyne for his stewardship of that program. And can I thank you finally for your forbearance, for allowing me to actually make these remarks after our first anniversary, which of course occurred on the 1st of July, a couple of weeks ago. John is a very insistent partner in our strategic program, and he's been haranguing me now for quite some months to get on and make some commentary, but I asked him to accommodate me and allow me to make these remarks post 1 July because I thought it would be an appropriate milestone to have a retroflective and a bit of a prospective look about what's ahead for the Australian Border Force. Tonight I also will, in that prospective look into the future, will publicly expose for the first time a document which we refer to in the department as the Australian Border Force 2020, ABF 2020. It's a document that we've launched internally already, but tonight will be the first public exposure of that document, and there'll be hard copies made available in amongst the auditorium later on. Anthony spoke a little bit about the operating environment in which we work, and he spoke of both volumes and threats, and I want to talk a little bit about that operating context. It's very germane to my commentary tonight, and in fact it forms the backdrop of the way we arrange our resources and the way we deploy those resources and the decisions that we make in relation to where those resources ultimately end up being prioritised to. And in fact, the operating context to a large degree was the genesis behind the merger of what was the former Australian Customs and Border Protection Service and the former Department of Immigration and Border Protection. Globalisation, of course, creates an interconnectedness, and it certainly has been one of our most fundamental, and will continue to be one of our most fundamental challenges going into our future. I was doing some research with my long-suffering speechwriters in advance of this address, and we were looking at some statistics in relation to global interconnectedness. And the global aviation airline industry in the last 12 months has transported 3.5 billion passengers. So that's an equivalent of half of the world's population. Those same planes have flown in and around the world 51 million metric tonnes of air cargo. But the most phenomenal stat that I found in all that was they've done that across 51,000 individual routes. So you just think about that. I actually paused and reflected on that particular statistic. There are sort of roughly 180 odd countries in the world, depending which ones you count and which ones you don't. But if you think about a hologramic projection of the globe, and you superimpose upon that 51,000 parabolic lines which represent each one of those routes, it just gives you an impression of how interconnected, how globalised the world currently is. And of course, that doesn't account for the sea cargo domain where in that same period of time, that particular sector transported about 10 billion metric tonnes of cargo around the world. And of course, Australia is not isolated from the world. It throws its portals open to the world, and since the arrival of the second fleet, which was desperately awaited by the first fleet arrivals for sustenance, they couldn't find the means to sustain themselves between the arrival of the first and second fleets, and they're at the point of starvation and suffered many privations in that period of time. But since that time, Australia has opened up its gateway to the world, and obviously we do that because not only does it sustain us, it contributes to our economic prosperity, but moreover, we want to be connected to the world because we like the enrichment, we like the social, the cultural, the intellectual enrichment. So for all those reasons, we open up our portals to the world. Well, out of that large volume of movement that I talked about, what does that mean for Australia? Well, let me give you some statistics from the Australian perspective. So the last 12 months, we processed about 37 million passengers ingressing and egressing our borders, primarily in the aviation sector, but also in the cruise line industry and other maritime arrivals. We processed about 2.5 million sea cargo containers. And again, that's a statistic that could just bypass you unless you try and analogize it. And I did, and I put together a mental map of all of those containers lined end to end, creating one long tunnel that stretches from Sydney to Cairo. It's a hell of a long way. In that same period of time, we processed 35 million air cargo consignments and somewhere in the order of 220 million international mail articles. And while we're doing all that, the retail side of the department, as I call it, issued about 7.5 million visas for people to come and travel to our country. So the very, very large volumes. They're all growing, of course. if I can give you an example of the growth, in the international mail domain alone, over the forward estimates, or 4 years for those who don't work in budget cycles, our international mail environment is projected to grow by 54%. Not quite exponential, but driven and impelled by e-commerce. That is a huge growth forecast. And so when you think of that alone, that is a sheer challenge in and of itself, but it is then compounded by what I call the threat environment, and Anthony referenced that as well. And that is an environment which has a multiplicity of threats. They range from transnational criminality to national security threats and what we generally in the business call community safety. Commodities that might harm us. Australia, as you know, has a universal ban on the importation of asbestos. Intellectual property fraud, which creates low-value, high-risk pharmaceuticals, vehicle parts, aviation spare parts. These are all things that are within the remit of the Border Force. So let me give you some examples of the more graver threats that I foresee in that particular threat environment. So illicit drugs have always been a threat to this country since we established our federation. Indeed, prior to federation, there were drugs, and mainly alcohol in those days, imported into the separate colonies of New South Wales and Victoria. But of course, the drug market has evolved, and I was recently in Europol having a chat with the director of Europol, Rob Wainwright, a very good colleague and friend. He was telling me that in the first 6 months of this calendar year that the port of Rotterdam had intercepted 30 tonnes of cocaine, primarily from South America. And the reason that volume is so high is Rotterdam is one of the primary ports of Europe, and that drug was being imported to service the entire European market. And you think, wow, that's a really big problem when we in this country see somewhere between 4, 5, 6 tonnes of drugs a year. But on a pro rata basis, when you think of a European population of 500 million, we are actually comparable plus. We're a lucrative market. We pay a high dollar for drugs as a consumption market, and it's attractive to transnational crime syndicates. And of course, the drug that's up in neon lights at the moment is methamphetamine, or ice. Its epicenter is in China. That is no secret. Open source information tells us that. Our intelligence corroborates it. And the permissive environment, particularly in the south of China, is the embarkation point for most of the Antipodean amphetamine that both ourselves and our New Zealand colleagues suffer from. Another threat, illegal or regular migration. Having been an amateur student of history, I have looked at some of the archives of the old customs department, as it was one of the original departments on the creation of Federation. And even then, in 1901, there was an inspector who travelled into the Indonesian archipelago and in other fields far-flung to investigate the embarkation point for Chinese stowaways on vessels that were arriving into Australia's ports. But of course, the problem has evolved also, and the scale of illegal migration that we see today is phenomenal compared to the scale we saw back then. Our Operation Sovereign Borders model, of course, with all its key planks, has been very effective in staunching what was a fairly free-flowing stream of irregular and illegal migration, which reached its peak in the mid-2013 period. It is currently at a point of equilibrium. We know there are still pools of potential illegal immigrants that are spread across the archipelago of Indonesia, mainly in the island of Java, who are waiting. They're waiting for some chink in the armour. They're waiting for some softening of the policy or the resolve in the Australian context. We have an extraordinarily strong fleet out on the water and in the air, and we're doing some really good work with our partners, both offshore and onshore, to make sure that we are on the right end of that Mexican standoff. And of course, globally, people smuggling is a problem. Again, having a chat with Rob Wainwright, he was telling me that the Europol database has names of tens of thousands of people smugglers, those that are actually engaged in the craft of smuggling humans. And those people are actually tapping into the market demand of 1 million plus potential migrants that are pooled in the north of Africa. As you will have read about in news articles, there are 1 million plus migrants that have moved across the Mediterranean and across the Aegean, and they're currently in the broader continental Europe trying to find settlement solutions. But there are more waiting to get across that gap. The Europeans have made some effort to try and stem that flow. There has been recently an agreement between Turkey and Greece in terms of returns. The Europeans have started to adopt some elements that we see in our Operation Sovereign Borders model, but we also see that the people smugglers move very agilely and flexibly, and we see a displacement effect. And we see those streams of migrants trying to get into Europe through Central and Eastern European countries. The threat I am concerned about is of those 1 million migrants that are pooled in the north of Africa from sub-Sahara and the Middle East, even if 5% of that cohort decides Europe's getting a little bit tough and I might look elsewhere, if that small sliver turns around and starts heading south, those 50,000 people represent the entirety of what was heading our way in 2013. And that would again grow that problem and that threat for us. And of course, the last threat I want to talk about is terrorism, relatively new, and I say relatively new. Violence committed in the name of religion has been around since time immemorial, and the annals of history are dotted with acts of violence of even just the monotheistic religions of the world, Islam, Judaism and Christianity. But the last 2 decades have seen the rise of Islamic extremism, which in our modern interpretation has been the worst it's ever been. And we are not in this country immune from that. As the tentacles of the ISIS ideology starts threading its way inexorably south, as the ISIS ideology gets franchised across the internet and radicalises our young men and women, we see domestic terrorist plots and we see international terrorist plots. And the border has a role in this. The Australian Border Force over the last couple of years has been working very actively, dealing with the outflow of potential foreign fighters, and we have stopped foreign fighters from going to the Middle East. We're starting to deal with the small trickle back of foreign fighters coming back our way. Still in small numbers as they get disenfranchised or decide that that life is no longer for them, and we play our role in receiving those people, the ones we know about. We're also on the alert for the ones we don't know about. We don't want people coming back more radicalised, battle-hardened, with violent skills that take up leadership roles in our community and radicalise more youth. And of course, we see the outflow of money and materiel in support of terrorists in the Middle East. And again, we play a role at the border to ensure that we are not contributing to the funding of terrorism in the Middle East. So, how have we fared over the last 12 months against these dual threats? Well, I think I've got a bit of a report card here, but the point I wanted to make that the Secretary and I have talked about for quite a number of years now is the dual imperatives that we have of facilitating and enforcing. And Anthony mentioned that in his introductory comments. Both the former Customs Service and the former Immigration Department has, over the decades, always swung the pendulum one way or another, dialing up to facilitation to the detriment of security, or vice versa, dialing up to security to the detriment of facilitation. We have taken the philosophy that those two settings are symbiotic. We do both. We have to facilitate trade and travel for all that enrichment I talked about before, but we have to forensically identify those threats, some of which I mentioned, in that flow of material and humans, and make sure that we excise that out of the flow to secure our borders. And so on the facilitation side, I give ourselves a B+. By our standard key performance indicator measures under our portfolio budget statement, for those of you that prepare these things, we're doing okay. Passenger facilitation, we're supposed to clear every single passenger within 30 minutes, 92% of the time. Are we achieving that? Not quite, but because our measures haven't quite caught up with changes in the evolving environment of aviation, where we get off-terminal arrivals and we get concertinaed schedules because of airport curfews and a whole range of things, we're doing okay on that front. Trade, we're doing all right as well. We, across the world, customs fraternity, do a lot of studying of how long it takes to release goods off the wharf, time release studies of that nature. We're right up there in the report card in countries in the developing world. And that is despite some of the mechanised, very manual, very arcane processes that we have at the border. And I'll talk a little bit more about what we're doing in that space to make sure that not only we're doing okay, we're going to be world leaders in that. Enforcement, again, I give ourselves a B+. Our screening rates in terms of frequency are okay. We look at about 100,000 of those 2.5 million cargo containers. It's a pretty good strike rate. We open 2 million or so air cargo consignments. We screen 50 million mail articles. So the screening stats are okay, and we're doing fine against our own benchmarks in that respect. Detections are good. In the last financial year, we made 14,500 detections of major drugs, the heroin, MDMA, amphetamine, heroin, cocaine, etc. We seized 1,300 firearm parts and whole firearms, made 80 major detections of illicit tobacco, rounded up 10,000 unlawful non-citizens, 1,400 people that are working illegally in the country. So the stats are okay. Counter-terrorism, I think we're doing very well in. Our most visible contribution to the counter-terrorism effort in this country, in addition to working with our partners, is our counter-terrorism teams. We have 100 men and women in uniform at the border across the 8 major international airports that are working hard to stop that outflow of foreign fighters, to make sure that currency is not carried out of the country to fund terrorism anywhere in the world. And in the last 12 months, those 100 men and women have talked to 185,000 people on their way out. They've offloaded hundreds of people off flights, had many, many hundreds of good national security incomes, intelligence has been derived, and they've prevented the flow of money by the millions out of this country. Doing a very good job in that respect. Maritime operations, I mentioned Operation Sovereign Borders, but we have 7 other maritime threats. Robbery, piracy, exploitation of natural resources, illegal foreign fishing. In the last 12 months, the work of the men and women of our Maritime Border Command has seriously disrupted some entrenched recidivist illegal fishers. Work that has pretty much gone unnoticed, but has had a profound impact upon the exploitation of fishing stocks, not just in the Southern Ocean, but to our immediate north. And that's been done on a fairly modest fleet, covering 45 square million kilometres. 11% of the world's oceans are covered. They do a great job. But where do I give us an A? This is Secretary, a bit of self-congratulation. Is in our integration and reform work, and I want to talk a little bit about that before I move on to the next few years. The words integration and reform have become, to some extent, somewhat synonymous in our organisation, but they are very different things. The then Minister Morrison, in May 2014, made a public announcement that the Immigration Department and the Customs and Border Protection Service would merge into a single entity. Gave us the relative luxury of doing that over a period of some time, and we both statutorily and publicly stood up on the 1st of July 2015. We've just called time on the integration a couple of weeks ago. We had a full 12 months further from that period of time to finish the integration, and there's a little bit left to be done under the radar, but more or less we've created an integrated department. It's been a hell of a journey. But it's a great diarchal model led by the Secretary. At a subset of that, the ABF has integrated as well. It's integrated the operational functions of the former Customs Service and the former operational components of the Immigration Department. So what do we do now? Well, we do all of that trade and traveller facilitation I talked about and its concomitant enforcement parts. We collect revenue, second highest collective revenue across the Commonwealth behind ATO, Tax Office. Last year we collected $18 billion in revenue, both GST, excise and other duties payable. We run the immigration enforcement, we manage our detention centres offshore, we provide support to our partners in Nauru and New Guinea in the running of the regional processing centres, administration of contracts. Maritime enforcement and, of course, investigations. And I acknowledge Wayne Buckhorn, who is our Assistant Commissioner on Secondment from the Australian Federal Police, who was with us for a period of time to undertake some professionalisation and modernisation of our investigations division. Within the ABF, we've created blended teams very similar to the AFP, blended both in the context of sworn and unsworn officers, but blended also in the context of former immigration and former customs officers. We are now one ABF. We have put 3,000 officers through what we call the Operational Readiness Assessment, which consists of elements of psychometric and physical testing to ensure they're capable of doing the job we're asking them to do. We have sworn in 3,700 ABF officers, designating positions that require a sworn oath to be taken, an allegiance to the ABF, and an allegiance to the values of the ABF. And of course, we've established an Australian Border Force College, which has been primarily busy with pumping out new graduates. We've had 200 new ABF uniform graduates come out in the last 12 months, and they are an absolute testament to the professionalism and diligence of young men and women who want to serve in the public service and who want to work in an exciting law enforcement role. They are cross-pollinated, cross-trained, enthusiastic, and in fact, what really struck me was that their profile is very, very similar to what we see across law enforcement. So you talk to the Australian Federal Police Commissioner and he will tell you that the average profile of a recruit in the AFP is around 28 years of age, someone who's had 10 years or so of work experience, someone who has one or more graduate degrees. And we're seeing a very, very similar profile coming through in our ABF college. So that's integration. Let me talk a little bit about reform. Both the Immigration Department and the Customs Service went through the obligatory Australian Public Service Commission capability reviews in 2012 and 13 respectively. They weren't good report cards by any stretch. They had similar identified deficiencies across both organisations. They were not critical of those entities as having fulfilled and discharged all of their duties and remit obligations historically, but they certainly found that both entities were not prepared for the future. They were not prepared for those volumes I talked about. They weren't prepared for the complexities of those challenges of the threat environment that I talked about. And in fact, one of the geneses of the former customs reform program that started prior to the integration of the two entities was the identification of a corrupt cell of officers at Sydney Airport who were involved with criminals in the importation of drugs into this country. But when we looked at that, as much as an indictment was on those individuals, it was simply just one manifestation of the underlying causal problems which the capability reviews found. And so anyone that's ever studied the manifestation of corruption knows that things like workforce stagnation, poor leadership, lack of integrity systems will lead to corruption. All those preconditions existed to create that corruption, but all those preconditions also existed to make both entities abjectly incapable of dealing with what was ahead. And so reform was critical, and it was necessary, and it was embarked upon. And so it would take me many more ASPI addresses, and I would subordinate to the Secretary on this to give you even a broad understanding of how deep and how transformational, how profound the DIBP reform program is. Secretary Pizzullo and I have lived and breathed this for the last couple of years, and there's still a long way to go, but we have a multi-year, very transformational reform program in play. What I want to do tonight, though, to give you a bit of a flavour, is to give you some vignettes of how that's playing out in how the ABF capabilities are starting to be built and developed. And I'll skip through those very quickly, John. I know the clock is ticking. We asked a former Director General of at least 2 intelligence agencies in Australia, David Irvine, to come and review our intelligence capability. Our intelligence capabilities were very good at a tactical level, but they required significant recalibration to deal with and to cue the resources of both entities to where they needed to be into the future. David Irvine said, yep, needs significant change, made 107 recommendations. We are in the process of implementing all of those to deliver us an intelligence capability which, in an enforcement capacity, will be world-class, but moreover, will not just give us that tactical intelligence support that's needed at the front line, but will give us the strategic, thematic and operational intelligence that allows the decision makers at the highest levels in the organisation to actually make wise, prudent decisions about where to best to place those resources. We've got a project called the Connected Information Environment. Both previous entities had disparate systems built up in a bespoke, boutique manner. We are trying to consolidate that into one single information environment. And it won't surprise you to know that we are going to connect 120 data sources from across both those entities into a single information environment, so that one officer can actually type in one name and get a single window view of any entity that he or she might be interested in. It's a major endeavour. We are driving hard on the build of Authorised Economic Operator Program, ATT. Sounds a little bit boring to those who aren't in the trade or in the business, but I can tell you it's profound change in the way trade will be undertaken in this country. And the premise of it goes something like this. There are, in the trade industry, probably about 98% of traders who are reputable, who are worried about their own reputation, who have got good, strong compliance systems, who assure themselves of their supply chains because they don't want their products to be contaminated by slave labour. They don't want their products to be contaminated by hazardous waste. They don't want their products or their consignments loaded up by drugs through transnational crime involvement. They have more assurance, better integrity systems, better knowledge about their supply chains than we ever will. And so we say, well, how do we leverage off all of that goodwill sentiment and integrity in their systems? Easy. We create a trusted system. We let them self-accredit. We overlay a capability that allows us from time to time to put some compliance and audit activity into place. And suddenly we are able to excise out of our consideration the vast majority of traders in this country and allow us to focus our resources on that 2% sliver that represents the highest risk. And that's quite a selfish perspective, because on the flip side of the coin, what that actually then creates is seamless trade, more efficient, more productive, and in the end, a better economic bottom line, not just for those individual companies, but for Australia's prosperity. We have got new capabilities in terms of laws. We introduced a nice little tool under Section 501 of the Migration Act, which allows us to cancel the visas of people who have been convicted of jail sentences of 12 months or more, or who fail a character provision because of cumulative behaviours that we can demonstrate through intelligence holdings. Through that tool, we have cancelled or refused the visas of 100 organised crime members and have removed them from the country, or they're in the process of being removed. And I can tell you how strongly the state and territory and the Commonwealth Police attest to the power of that tool to disrupt organised crime. The damage that we've been able to do to organised motorcycle gang activity in this country in that short period of time, since that law was introduced in the last couple of years, it's been more profound, quicker and more effective than running long-term organised crime investigations that cost a truckload of money and resources. And let me finish on investigations before I talk about the ABF 2020 document in finality. I mentioned that we are modernising, we are professionalising our investigations capability. It is much needed. The involvement of transnational crime syndicates in not just the importation of those commodities I mentioned, firearms, drugs, etc., but in visa fraud. In exploiting our visa system as both a commodity and as an enabler of organised crime, we've had a good look under the rocks, and there is significant involvement of offshore and onshore organised crime in our visa system. And we are matching our investigations activity and our investigations capability to match. And we are doing it in conjunction with our good partners in the Australian Federal Police. And we are making sure that our collective but scarce resources in the investigative space are properly demarcated, properly prioritised, and are operating on the same methodology. And Wayne, I thank you for your efforts in that regard, and your predecessor, Steve Lancaster, and we're significantly more advanced than we were 12 months ago. So thank you for your efforts in that respect. So where to next? 5 minutes or less. Well, we've got a lot to do, as I mentioned. The ABF 2020 booklet is a booklet that describes our current state, it describes our future state, and it describes how we're going to get from our current state to our future state. It will talk about, and you can flick through it later on if you wish, things that we want to do, things that are very practical, but will make a very big difference in the way we actually operate and our efficacy at the border. Things like the introduction of technology. So we are investing heavily in smart gates. We have been for a while, for a couple of years on inbound, and the take-up rate on our inbound smart gates is around 40%. I'd like it to be higher, because I want to liberate those human beings at the primary line away from that high volume, low value work to high value, low volume work. We are in the middle of installing 90 departure gates. In fact, Sydney Airport has the largest bank of smart gates in the world at the departure point, 24 in a row. And the cycle rate and the effect that it's having on the throughput of passengers passing, egressing through the border is just amazing. And you talk to our operators on the front line, you talk to our industry, both the airport operators and the airlines, and they complement that particular capability. But it's not enough for us. We want to move to the next evolution. We want to move to e-corridors. We don't want people to walk through a portal and have to stand there for 28 seconds, which is the current cycle rate of smart gates. We want 400 people to get off an Airbus, land at Sydney Airport, walk through an e-corridor, have their facial features recognised through facial recognition software, have that matched to their passport check-in details, and they walk through and pick up their bags without talking to a single human being. And the 4 people on that Airbus that we want to talk to, that we've identified in advance through intelligence, data analytics, we'll excise them out of that stream and we'll have a bit of a chat with them. We are obviously, with many, many other departments and agencies, moving very much to digitisation and technology and mobility. We're trying to untether our officers off the desks, off the uploads on clunky platforms. We've rolled out devices, mobile devices, where they can download and upload data from the field. And the feedback is great. The men and women like it, and their productivity is suddenly been increased, not just twofold, fourfold. We want to develop our human capital. We want to make sure that the people have the right skills, the right training, the right aptitude, that we've got a homogenous, flexible workforce that we can deploy and surge to wherever the threat may be. We are very keen to ensure that we capitalise on our Trusted Trader program by creating a single window. Traders who want to trade with Australia currently have to go through any number of portals to engage with any number of departments at the Commonwealth and state level. What we want to do is create a single window, one touch point, one single identifier, one single set of requirements for any trader to deal with Australia. Again, a project we have in play. So let me pull up there in the interest of time. I do commend this booklet to you. It demonstrates what we will engage and embark upon for the next 3.5 years. It's an easy read, and it's certainly something I'm happy to talk about into the future. Ultimately, where we want to get to is very simple. We have a very simple mission. We want to protect Australia's border. We want to manage the movement of people and goods across it. And we have to go through this critical reform path to get there. Thank you.
Good evening, Secretary, Your Excellency. Thank you very much, Roman. On a night like tonight, the most difficult part for our guest speaker is, of course, volunteering to do Q&A to a mixed audience with very many different ideas. So Commissioner Quadley has agreed to do Q&A this evening, and I have the great honour and privilege of moderating that as best I can. As is the privilege here of being the moderator, I get to ask the first question, which I steal from my boss, who does that quite often. And of course, it is a difficult one, which is a lot of the discussion this evening, Roman, has been about the activities that have been achieved at the border, and talking a lot about the threats, etc., that are manifesting before, through, and beyond the border. Whilst the US have taken an ICE model where they're working heavily inside the border, I wonder if you care to talk a little bit about ABF's future working inside and outside of the border itself and the physical space?
Yeah, thanks, John. We view the border as a continuum. We define it by an offshore environment where the primary embarkation points of all those threats I talked about are. We view it obviously at the physical border where historically most of our assets have been deployed and currently still are. But even beyond the border, inside the border, there is, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of enforcement work to be done. Across that entire continuum, partnerships are imperative. The Australian Federal Police has had an ideology now for 10 years or more, which is taking the fight offshore, and it's something I'm actually subscribed to. We can play goalkeeper at the border all day long, and we will improve our technology, we'll improve our tradecraft, we'll improve our targeting, we'll improve our intelligence, and what you'll see is a commensurate increase in seizures. But that doesn't actually nip the problem in the bud. So there is a need, I believe, in working preemptively offshore, but the fatal mistake that we can make is to do that in a siloed or compartmentalised manner. So when I look at examples like, I'll give you a very real example, if I look at the law enforcement community that operates out of Bangkok in Thailand. So Bangkok has been a locus which has been forward operating base for a lot of foreign law enforcement agencies because of its proximity to the Mekong Delta. Mekong Delta, as we all know, has been the genesis point for the production of heroin across the world for 3 decades or more. And even with the advent of heroin production in Southwest Asia, the Southeast Asian Mekong Delta is still a significant production point for both heroin and now more latterly methamphetamine, where the infrastructure has been exploited for the production of ice. And within that foreign law enforcement community in Bangkok, there is largely a collaborative and collegiate sentiment, but by and large, the delivery of capacity building programs to the Southeast Asian partners, the conduct of bilateral operations with the partners, and even unilateral operations which are preventative in terms of the host nations for all those foreign law enforcement fraternity, are done in a compartmentalised way. Australia hasn't done remarkably much better in the past, so we certainly have a presence from a ex-Customs, now ABF perspective in Bangkok, as does the Australian Federal Police, the Australian Crime Commission, or the ACIC now, has from time to time put temporary replacements in there. I think there is still room for improvement in terms of the Team Australia approach. Pooling of resourcing, pooling of expertise, pooling of intelligence, pooling of capacity building can only help, and we are, in the last 12 months, doing some really good work with our Mekong partners in an operation called Safe Mekong, where our domestic agencies have collaborated and are providing both funding and logistical support to those nations to run counter-drug operations across the Mekong River. And it's, I think, a very good illustration of how we must work preemptively offshore. There is obviously a need to work collaboratively at the border, at the physical border. The Australian Federal Police and ourselves share a responsibility there. So we have, as an ABF, the responsibility for the prevention of prohibited goods into the country. The Australian Federal Police has a responsibility for the investigation of crimes against the Commonwealth statutes, and one of those is obviously the disruption of organised crime. But together we have a preventative role in that respect. And then, if I take that continuum to its last point, we are a national agency. We have to work very collaboratively with state and territory police, and I can point to, as an example, where there is human trafficking, sexual slavery that occurs in either licensed or unlicensed brothels across this country. There are many, many equities at the municipal, state and territory police, ABF, Department of Immigration and Border Protection, and AFP responsibilities. No single agency that I've mentioned can actually tackle that problem of enslaved women working under debt bondage in those particular establishments alone. It needs a collaborative effort.
So now that I've done and used my prerogative, I was wondering if I can open the floor up now. We have about 10 minutes available for questions and answers. David Connery.
Yes, thanks, David. I think the premise of your question implies that the cultural change is complete, and I can assure you it is absolutely not. We are not seeking, of course, to create a single monoculture in the organisation. We are seeking to create a single set of values, operating methodologies, but I think it's fair to say that even both legacy entities prior to the amalgamation carried their own subcultures. They were both in a functional sense, because we're very solid in the way our functions work, but also in a geographical sense, because we're quite dispersed, and that's just the nature of the country in which we work. We found, when we did both formal and informal surveying of the culture of the organisation, quite a broad spectrum of cultures. Some healthy, some not so healthy. And we have worked tirelessly to ensure that we are trying to imbue in the organisation the right preconditions to allow a healthy culture to manifest. We have not been able to do that alone. We have engaged some very experienced partners, for example, Nous and Ernst & Young, in the first instance, to actually take a litmus test of what the culture, what the general prevailing sentiments were across the workforce. No real surprises in any of that, but then to try and use all of the communication media that we have to try and deliver a cultural message through the organisation. It's extraordinarily difficult. What we have found is that the ability for us to penetrate right through to the frontline officer, to have that officer understand in a very palatable format what it is we're actually asking that officer to do and be and act and think like, is very, very difficult. There is no panacea, there is no silver bullet. I can absolutely assure you of that. My expectation is that it will take us, if not a generation, certainly a decade to actually achieve a culture which is largely homogenous, but certainly healthy. And when I look to other comparisons, 1979, the amalgamation of the Commonwealth Police and the Anti-Narcotics Bureau and Commonwealth Police, it took quite a while for the Australian Federal Police, as it merged out of that amalgamation, to have an identity of its own, to develop a healthy, strong and identifiable culture. It's something that the Secretary and I talk about every single week with our executive. We have it as a standing agenda on almost every single forum that we have internally, and we measure it, and it's a work in progress.
Do we have any other questions? Okay, it's very hard to sum up a day or an evening like this in a long speech. One thing I will say is that, and I'll do it more anecdotally, which is I was sitting on a mountain in East Timor in 2000 with, which is often I do, with a platoon of soldiers from the 6th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment. And I was looking out, it was about a kilometre off the East Timor-Indonesian border. And I look out across there, and at the time, and 6 had been, although it was now 16 years ago, they're armed with the best optics. So at the time, they've got night vision goggles, they've got everything else. It was the early part of 2000. It should have been really quite easy to do border security, and I remember sitting there thinking, this is a doddle. You sit up here at Patrol Base Sparrow, infantry guys go out and patrol every day. They can see the Indonesians can see them. Nothing can get across that border. Over that year, militia, smugglers, black marketeers, refugees, amongst other people, would cross that border consistently, time and time again, and a number of lives would be lost over that period of time. I then found myself at the end of that period of time reflecting on 2 points, which is number one, that this border security gig mightn't be so easy, and number two is that militarisation of borders just doesn't work. I find myself 16 years later, and we find ourselves on an evening like tonight on a little bit of a figurative hill, looking over 12 months of the Australian Border Force, where they're going next and what's going on. And we're reminded with that a couple of things. Number one is right at the beginning of this, which is that despite some very large gaps in the public policy dialogue and media coverage of border security, this thing called border security, of 2 words, is incredibly complex, is multi-dimensional, has multi-dimensional amorphous threats that continue to change day in, day out. The threats themselves are entrepreneurial, and there's a lot of throwaway lines and descriptors there, but they change on a moment's notice. Public policy doesn't, and those who've been in Canberra long enough, and there's a few familiar faces around here, know how long it takes to change policy and strategy normally. Transforming an organisation, or let alone 2 organisations, to face that new threat is incredibly difficult. The second key point with all this is that if we look and reflect on the 12 months of achievements that Roman has outlined for us, and Secretary Pazoulos, and they're shaking his head agreeing with, which was, the people of the department who get quite often the rough end of the stick in media coverage, if you listen to the amount of things that they have seized, the quantity of things they have searched, and the list goes on about the successes that they have had, which hardly ever rate a mention in public policy at all. And I think that where it brings it. Events like this and ASPI bringing together people like the Commissioner and others to talk about border security highlights that border security isn't a game in balancing. Okay, simply reducing the border security debate into zeros and ones of shall we secure the border or not secure the border, shall we do offshore processing or not do offshore processing is not just poor descriptors, it's unhelpful in that debate. The facts remain is that border security is an incredibly complex problem to face, that now modern day border security agencies must work forward, at and before the border. And with that in mind, I'd like to first off thank the Commissioner for coming here this evening and speaking at ASPI, and I have been hassling him for some time. Secondly, I'd like to invite you all to join us for some refreshments, and as again, using one of my boss's favourite lines, some of ASPI's very famous snacks as well. So thank you very much for joining us this evening.